Hi, I'm Kira from the Scottish Climate Intelligence Service, here to give you a bit of a demo of the ClimateView platform. So we can go ahead and head over to the internet. And what you're seeing here is the public-facing dashboard of the ClimateView software. And what I really want to convey is that ClimateView can help with four things, one of which is for showing your area-wide emissions. So you might be more familiar with your organizational or corporate emissions for your local authority. That would be more the emissions from your actual local authority operations. But here, this is showing your area-wide emissions, so these are the territorial emissions for the whole of your local authority. So the emissions really show you your current state of where you're at in terms of decreasing emissions. Then you have this transition section. This is all about exploring different pathways to net zero. You have interventions, so this becomes a central place to store all of the things that you're doing to try to make that pathway happen, and indicators as a way of tracking your progress. So if we go ahead and dig into emissions, what you're seeing here is Averageville, and Averageville is an average of the 32 local authorities in Scotland. So we've gone ahead and calculated the emissions for all 32 as well as then Averageville. And what the diagram on the left is showing is how that emissions breaks down in terms of these different categories of emissions. So you can see the largest category here is currently a FULU, so that's agriculture, forestry, and other land use, followed by buildings, then transport, industry, and this last category is waste. And the graph on the right, this is showing the historical emissions. So we've calculated the emissions from 2005 up until 2022. At the moment, 2022 is our most recent emissions data set because we require quite a few national data sets in order to produce this, and we'll have the 2023 emissions later this year. And you can see from the graph here that there is this generally downward trajectory that we can see emissions have been decreasing, but this has largely been due to decreases in the industrial sector as well as buildings, and quite a lot of this is due to the decarbonization of the grid. And this is an interactive diagram, so we can dig into the tree diagram on the left, and if we click on a FULU, we can see that the largest category here is land, followed by livestock. A small technicality here, at the moment, this is still a beta version of the dashboard, and it's not actually showing negative emissions, so this isn't accounting for the emissions from sequestration in land, so this category will actually be smaller when you see the negative emissions as well. And if we come back out, we can do the same thing for buildings, so we can dive into buildings and see we have the emissions. Most emissions are coming from residential buildings as opposed to non-residential buildings. And you can go one step further down as well, and this will show you the graph on the right is corresponding to how you dig into the emissions. Now, I do want to show you where the numbers live, which is over in the inventory section. So this isn't part of the public dashboard, but I wanted to show you this section, and what this is showing are the numbers behind all of those graphs. So here you can see the emissions from 2005, again, up until 2022. But it's just to emphasize that at the moment, that beta version of the dashboard only lets you go down so many levels, but we've actually calculated the emissions to a greater level of granularity, which will soon be on the dashboard as well. So as an example, we can dig into transport. So we can see transport here. You have the options of mobility and freight. If we go into mobility, we can then see road, rail, aviation, and waterborne. If we go into road, and then light duty vehicles, and then here we can see that divide between current petrol and diesel cars. So again, this is more detail that we'll show in the dashboard in the future. And now to talk about modeling, we do have to do a bit of theory. So the ClimateView framework relies on this concept of transition elements, called so because they look a bit like a periodic table of elements. And the transition elements are all about activity shifts. So these are shifts from high carbon activities to low carbon activities. So things like shift of the vehicle kilometers of fossil fuel vehicles to vehicle kilometers of electric vehicles, or vehicle kilometers of fossil fuel vehicles to walking and cycling, or fossil fuel vehicles to tram. I think you get the picture. So those would be examples of the transport transition elements, but we also have transition elements for industry, agriculture, building, energy, and waste. And the idea with each of these transition elements is that the activity shift is quantifiable in terms of carbon. So that makes the transition elements this little package of math that allows you to do the modeling. And while climate change is this big, massive problem, there are governments all around the world trying to solve the same problem and trying to make these same activity shifts happen, which is why the transition elements follow the internationally standard mitigation options from the IPCC. So these are the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change mitigation options. And while there's infinite ways of trying to make these activity shifts happen in terms of interventions, which we'll get to, the transition elements act as your limited menu of options for exploring this mitigation pathway. So how this looks in the platform, we can come over to the section on transitions and then target balancing. And what this is showing is we have this target balance for each of those sections of emissions. So we have private transport and freight and industry and more on building heating systems. And this gray bar here, this is showing your emissions as pulled from the inventory, but those emissions have been projected out to 2045. So it's a bit hard to see here, but there is a slight increase in emissions here due to a very slight increase in population in Averageville out to 2045. And what's showing at the bottom of this graph is those transition elements. So again, those little packages of math that allow you to model as you shift from one activity to another, what that would do in terms of the emissions. So we can pull up the bar here. And so this is the bar for electric vehicles. So as we increase the use of electric vehicles, we can see our emissions come down. And you could say that you want to entirely decarbonize using electric vehicles. And again, you'll see your emissions come down, but they don't entirely go to zero here, because in this scenario, we haven't said that the grid gets to zero carbon emissions by 2045. So that's what you're seeing is a little gray bar that's still left. But it's also possible you have a future in which you don't want to entirely decarbonize with electric vehicles, so you can have less of a reliance on electric vehicles, but say you want to have more walking and cycling, or more use of electric buses, or more use of journey sharing. And you can use this target balancing as a way of trying out those different scenarios for net zero. So a little bit like a cooking show, we can show you, here's one we prepared earlier, except for this is the Swedish government board, and they've had a long-standing relationship with ClimateView, so they have a lot more information currently in their board. We can see here, we can go to their emissions page and see their current standing for area-wide emissions in Sweden. Their largest source is industry, followed by transport, agriculture, other here, which I believe is buildings, and then into energy. So same format as the Averageville board that we'll have for all the local authorities, but this is what it looks like for Sweden, who's actively using this board. But we can go over to transitions to see that this is the pathway that they've modeled to 2045 using that same concept of these transition elements. So the green is showing their transport, and then industry, agriculture, again, energy and other. And if we scroll down, this shows that third element, which is the interventions. So these are all the things that the Swedish government is doing in order to make this transition path happen. So here we can see that they have 246 interventions in their board, and by having them digital, one of the benefits of that is that you can search them. So here I can show you how they've used tags in order to filter through these interventions. So here we go to tags. I could see if I just want to see interventions that apply nationally, and that's limited the table here. And so if we click on any one of these interventions, we can see the affected transitions. And this is really where the transition element framework hinges on everything within ClimateView. So these interventions have been connected to the transition elements that they are trying to affect. So here we can see this intervention around action plan for plastics connects to just a few transition elements around waste, versus if we come down to a transition element or this intervention around carbon tax, and we go see the transition elements it's connected to, you can see that a carbon tax is trying to affect many things about the system, and so it affects many of these transition elements. You can also see this in a column view and attach pictures if that's a more engaging way of interacting with the interventions. But if we come back up to the transition pathway, we can now dig into that fourth thing around indicators. So this is also interactive, so if you click on any section, you can see more into that transportation pathway for getting to net zero. And I'll point out that as you click into the transition pathway, this is also another way of filtering the intervention. So here you can see that the Swedish board has only 152. I say only, but compared to their 246. So we have these 152 interventions as they relate to transport. And if we keep going into private transport, transport efficient society, and then say shift to walking and cycling. And what this graph is showing, you have the dotted green line in the background. So that's showing the modeled pathway for how the Swedish government anticipates using this transition element, shift to walking and cycling, in order to reach their target. And the white line is indicating the actual measured progress in terms of this shift to walking and cycling. So in the actual data, you can see this bump due to the pandemic, where we had a large increase in walking and cycling. It has since fallen back down, but they can still compare their actual progress towards their pathway necessary. And here you can see that they're roughly still on track. And this is one of the concepts that we're trying to emphasize with the Scottish Climate Intelligence Service, is a bit of a shift away from measuring progress in terms of emissions, which are always going to be at least 2 years lagged, and it's quite a fuzzy data set in order to attribute the interventions we're doing to the actual emissions reductions we're seeing, versus in addition to measuring the emissions, to actually look at these indicators that these transition elements are happening, and using this as another way of measuring progress. And again, here we have the intervention specifically just for that transition element. So again, I just want to highlight that the ClimateView can help with those 4 things. The emissions tell you where you're currently at. The transitions tell you where you want to get to. The interventions say what you're currently doing. And the indicators act as a way of measuring progress towards that goal. So thank you, and thank you for listening. And I will just go back to the PowerPoint. If you want to get in contact with us, you can reach out through these platforms, as well as our email there at the bottom. But yes, thank you for listening.